Hello. So, I asked if you guys would still want an Ele guide, and quite a few of you said yes. This is going to be hopefully as fast as possible while still being comprehensible. And also, a lot of this is going to be the same as 9.0. So, if you are only looking for a certain thing, make sure to check timestamps in description or the chapters on the video to jump around. Without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about stats and stat distributions. Currently for Elemental Shaman, every secondary stat is actually very good for single target. Even mastery, which is normally considered very bad. So you genuinely can run kind of whatever you want on single target and just use top gear sims to determine the best you have currently. However, mastery is significantly worse on AoE or any more than one target because of a hidden modifier on chain lightning that makes it proc less often. So I personally will go with much lower mastery because it doesn't have much of an effect on your single target damage. However, you become a lot more versatile by not having mastery in your tool set. So I have a fairly close to even amount of everything else, and I will show you how to sim to actually determine what's best from what you have right now. So first, get the Simulation Craft add-on in World of Warcraft. Just simply type in /SIMC into your chat box, and it'll open up this page. Control-C, copy that, then you'll open up a website called raidbots.com. My OBS is here. You go to Top Gear, and you paste it what you think you just copied into here. Then you can select whatever gear pieces you want. If you have premium, you can use like more than normal, but even without any money paid, you can still do this, just not as many iterations at once. You can pick a couple different things. You can pick different trinkets. You can pick different dom sockets. Here you can pick enchants. If you click on this, you can replace every enchant to see if you want to change it up a bit. This also includes dom sockets, gems, everything you can think of, soulbinds, literally everything, even talents. Then you just click on find top gear, and it will calculate for you and show you exactly what is best from everything you selected in a single target setting. So from everything I selected, it actually chose something I wasn't currently wearing, this ring and this neck. So like I said, for single target, I would actually use this, but for anything else, I would not because of the high mastery. And just to clarify, this is a lot better than using things like stat weights because stat weights can change very quickly. They're just a very inaccurate guideline because, you know, one enchant changing can suddenly make a certain stat less valuable. This means things like pawn strings are not very useful because they are only accurate for the exact gear set you have on right now. As soon as you change anything, they're suddenly no longer accurate. They don't account for losing stats. So I recommend doing this over doing stat weights. And so you can also change the target count and everything in this, but AoE sims are not quite as reliable. So for AoE, I just recommend going with as little mastery as possible, high crit, haste, and verse, and that's mostly it for stats. Let's talk about talent builds. What I have on right now is the very go-to raid build. I don't think I've changed this like at all in the whole raid. However, if you're not comfortable playing Ice Fury, because Ice Fury is very hard to play properly, Primal Elementalist is an option and does very similar damage. It is significantly easier to play, so if you're newer to Shaman, simply don't want to have to think that hard, or trying to raid lead or something, that is definitely an option that you can take advantage of without losing a whole lot of damage. For Mythic Plus, you want to go something more along these lines with a Storm Elemental build. Ancestral Guides is a lot better with AoE, and Aftershock's very good for AoE as well. I personally pretty much never change this in Mythic Plus. Some people run Earth and Rage, but either one of these is totally fine. Everything else, you can also run Master of the Elements if you want a little more single target, but lately I've just been playing Stormly in every single key. But there's a lot of vibe builds for AoE, so you can kind of mess around with a couple different talents, but I wouldn't change much other than these two. Now let's talk about Legendaries. So for the entire raid, I ran Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence. It is best for single target, and I think in this current raid, pretty much every fight, single target is the most important damage profile. There is an argument to be made for Echoes of the Great Sundering, and Echoes of the Great Sundering is also definitely better in Mythic Plus than Windspeakers. So if you're crafting your very first legendary and you do both raid and Mythic Plus, probably start with Echoes because it is comparable on single target and better on cleave. Echoes is definitely a lot harder to take advantage of in the raid though, because any type of movement or mistimed earthquakes are going to cause you to lose a lot of damage. Whereas Windspeakers allows you to have an extra cast on the move and just simply better single target damage that cannot be moved out of. Skybreakers used to be good in the previous patch, but I don't currently see any use for Skybreakers in PvE, and the only other one that I would ever really use is Seeds of Rampant Growth. in Mythic Plus. I actually really enjoyed this build. I think this build with these talents is actually very good, especially on tyrannical weeks, and especially in dungeons where mobs move a lot. So think things like Spires of Ascension, for example, where mobs jump out of Earthquake all the time. This build is a very good mix of single target and AoE without a whole lot of positional requirements. So I would definitely recommend giving this a try if you're Night Fae. You can't play this if you're not Night Fae. Now let's talk about Covenant choices and Soulbinds and Conduit trees and everything like that. So just to start off, every Covenant is actually fairly close in power, except for Venthyr. Venthyr is currently a decent bit behind for Ele. Granted, a decent bit only means like 500-ish DPS. So if you're not a super min-maxer and you really like Venthyr Ele Shaman, it is still viable, I would say. But if you're looking to do the most damage, which is probably why you're watching a guide, stay away from Venthyr right now in 9.1. The two top contending Covenants are going to be Necrolord and Night Fae. I do think Kyrian is good. I think it's fairly underrated, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be better than either of the other two options. But if you're looking to play Resto and Enhance as well, Kyrian could be a good choice for that. I think Necrolord is best in the raid right now, except for maybe on Sylvanas. In a couple, maybe like a couple fights, you could argue Night Fae for Karain. But I did progression as Necrolord, and I really thought that was better. But for Mythic Plus, I think Night Fae is better, and Night Fae is not far behind in the raid. So that's just one of those choices you're going to have to make on your own, which one you want to play. But that being said, I'm going to go through each Covenant and show you my personal take on what is the highest Conduit Soulbind setup. A lot of this is coming from Blood Mallet, but for the two Necrolord and Night Fae, I also kind of use my own judgment. And just to be clear, if you want to look at these on your own, top simming ones, go to bloodmallet.com. Very useful resource for this kind of stuff. You can see just about anything sims on there. But let's start with Kyrian. If I was playing Kyrian, I would pretty much only play Mechanicos, and I would run this Conduit setup. If you want to pause and look at all this, feel free to. However, if I was doing Mythic Plus, I would probably go here instead. I'll go down the middle here and take Hammer of Genesis, and then I would replace Pyroclastic Shock with the Legendaries. Everything else would stay the same. For Venthyr, this is the highest simming one. I don't actually know much about Venthyr, so I can't comment much on what I would do differently, but this is the highest simming setup. I think in general, if you're going to be doing Mythic Plus, no matter what build you're running, you'd want to replace Pyroclastic Shock with something else. Usually the Covenant specific one. I don't know how good the Venthyr one is though, so I can't really comment on that. For Necrolord, there's actually two options. For single target, Marileth is the one that sims the highest, with this build down like this. And I would run Irmer for AoE or Mythic Plus, and as you can see, run like this, and then you replace Pyroclastic Shock with Tumbling Waves, because Tumbling Waves is a little more versatile for different target counts than Pyroclastic Shock is. For Night Fae, for single targets, and for the Seeds Mythic Plus build, with the Siege Legendary, I would run Dreamweaver for pretty much everything. This is the build I'd run, except for in Mythic Plus Seeds build, I would replace Pyroclastic Shock with the Covenant one, Essential Extraction, and run that instead. For running Karain, this is what I would run pretty much every time you run Karain. Karain is almost always run on something with AoE, because you want that crit damage on your burst. You could also run Karain with the Siege Legendary, especially if it's like a Spiteful week or something where you have very good Karain uptime. I haven't really done enough Mythic Plus to be confident on either of these. I think they're both very good in their own way. Karain has a little more burst, Dreamweaver has a little more sustained, so you can make your own choice there. The one consistent thing with Ele Soulbinds is you replace Pyroclastic Shock with something else for AoE, and it doesn't actually really matter what you have in your empowered slot, because every Ele Soulbind scales very bad. They're all pretty much terrible, to be honest. So they all scale poor enough that like there isn't really a noticeable difference in what you put there. So I just been putting Call of Flame there in the meantime. But that covers it all for the Soulbinds and Covenant choices. Bit of a long one. So next let's talk about the rotation. So something I did last time that I thought went over pretty well was, after looking at the basic rotation, I looked at my own video of me killing a boss and just kind of went over it in real time. But first let's talk about on paper what the rotation is, or rather the priority list is what it's kind of referred to now. I went to stormearthandlava.com, which is a Ele Shaman guide website, selected the talents I'll be using and the Covenant I'll be using, and here we have a rotation list. This list mostly boils down to keep Firelay on cooldown, Flame Shock on the boss. Use your cooldown abilities like Phase Transfusion, Elemental Blast on cooldown. Don't worry too much about getting Elemental Blast with Master of the Elements. It's mostly for generating Maelstrom. Use Stormkeeper as much as you can on single target. Lightning Bolt with Stormkeeper and Master of the Elements up. First Shock to avoid overcapping Maelstrom and try to get it with Master of the Elements as well. Frost Shock with Ice Fury and Master of the Elements. But don't worry too much about that because it's going to be really hard to empower all these things at once. So mostly worry about getting Frost Shocks out before Ice Fury expires. Lava Burst on cooldown as much as possible. Ice Fury on cooldown as much as possible to keep it rolling. Lightning Bolt as a filler when you have time. If you have to move and you have nothing else to cast, you don't have anything, you don't have any Earth Shocks or Ice Fury charges or anything like that, just cast a basic Frost Shock. The more important list to look at is going to be down here. Special cases of Master of the Elements. This gives you the priority of what you'd want to empower with Master of the Elements. It's a pretty big part of Elemental Shaman gameplay, and a lot of people overthink it and end up losing damage. So, on paper, if there was multiple targets, you'd empower Earthquake, followed by a Stormkeeper charge, followed by Fate Transfusion, Earth Shock, Empowered Frost Shock, and these just don't matter. Don't think about this at all. If you don't have any of this or higher, and just cast second Lava Burst or whatever, don't think about it. So let's go over to the kill video now, and let's kind of watch this and then go over in real time. Skip to the pull timer. Precasting Stormkeeper on 5. Precasting Ele Blast before the pull. Make sure Ele Blast is precasted late enough that it is hit in the air after the boss is pulled, or you'll only get 20 Maelstrom because your Maelstrom resets when you enter combat to 20. So a little note there. Next global is going to be Flame Shock, or no, sorry, Fire Ele, then Flame Shock to get a longer duration Flame Shock, into a Lava Burst, into a Stormkeeper charge, into Lava Burst, into Earth Shock, Lava Burst, Stormkeeper charge. Another way to do the opener is to, instead of using Stormkeeper charge after your first Lava Burst, you can use Fate Transfusion if you have Dreamweaver, and then Lava Burst again, Stormkeeper charge, Earth Shock, without Master of the Elements on it, just to get another Lava Burst, get the proc, use the proc of Lava Burst, then Stormkeeper charge again. But difference is very minimal, so don't focus on that too much. Get Ice Fury on cooldown. Had to move here, Lava Burst all moving, Fate Transfusion with my Spirit was great stuff. Ended up being hit by the Silent Circle, which really sucked. Ele Blast gets off cooldown. Was off cooldown for a little bit there, which is actually kind of bad. Let's go back and watch this part. I think I definitely overcommitted to trying to get Fate Transfusion out here. It should have been... Since I had to move everything, I probably should have just waited or done it earlier. I tried to do it while moving, ended up getting silenced. And Elemental Blast has been on cooldown for quite a long time at this point. Earth Shock on the way in, so I can Ele Blast without overcapping. So I had 77 Maelstrom. Now I have very little time to get my Frost Shocks out, so I'm probably going to be spamming those pretty quickly here. Yeah, I just used them all back to back almost. Try to greed it a little bit to not overcap. And now a little bit more chill part of the rotation, just kind of filler stuff. Ele Blast immediately off cooldown. Keeping Flame Shock up. Love Bursting into an Earth Shock to keep that moted. Master of the Elements on that. Ice Fury now that it's back up. Unfortunately, because of the way we did the opener, Ice Fury and Stormkeeper do not overlap. If they overlap, you just simply cannot get all the charges out very well, so you want to do them independently most of the time. Now back to basic rotation, Elemental Blast on cooldown as much as possible. We're gonna, Lava Burst into Earth Shock again. If I had time, I decided I didn't have time there. Watching it back, I might have had time. In the moment, I had the two charges that were getting close to expiring. Casting Lava Burst here. The option was either to finish this Lava Burst into an Earth Shock, and then do 2 Frost Shocks, or do the 2 Frost Shocks, and then hopefully I could master the elements on the Earth Shock later. I decided to play it safe, spent the Frost Shocks. Now I refresh Flame Shock. How much duration was on that? It was kind of a bad refresh, because I already had 18 seconds on it. I was trying to bide a little bit of time to allow myself to cast Lava Burst before casting Earth Shock. A better global there would have been a Lightning Bolt. So, hindsight. See, this build is very complicated to play perfectly. This is why I'd recommend playing not Ice Fury, Primal Elementalist instead, if you are not confident in it. Your Stormkeeper's coming back up. Earth Shock, Elemental Blast. Gonna end up using Earth Shock here again, probably. I actually used Stormkeeper charge. Didn't matter because I didn't overcap. I got Master of the Elements on everything, didn't overcap at all, so what I did there was fine. I think at this point you probably get the idea. I don't think I need to watch the rest of it. It's mostly just a big juggling of all your cooldowns and charges of things that are unlimited timers. It's a very unique playstyle. I enjoy it a lot, but it's definitely very hard to pull off while doing mechanics and whatnot. So let's go to AoE now. Some dungeon gameplay. A little less to look at here, but there are some quirks that we're going to talk about. So I switched to Icy Veins for this part because I think it shows the AoE part a little better than the other website did. But basically on 2 and 3 targets, you just do the single target rotation, except you keep Flame Shock on all the targets, you Earthquake instead of Earth Shock, and you Chain Lightning instead of Lightning Bolt. Everything else is exactly the same as single target. With 4 targets, it is mostly just going to be Chain Lightning and Earthquake. There are a few very rare situations where that is not the case. Well, some not so rare, such as Echoes of the Great Sundering, where you'd want to use Earth Shock, alternate between the two, Earth Shock and Earthquake, to empower every Earthquake you have. And if you're using Master of the Elements and Echoes of the Great Sundering on 4 or more targets, you would want to use a Lava Burst before your Empowered Earthquake to empower that with Master of the Elements, as indicated here. You would want to maintain a Flame Shock on 1 target in order to do this with the automatic crit, or rather the guaranteed crit, on Lava Burst, and potential for a Lava Surge proc to make it a little faster. But other than Master of the Elements and Echoes, it's quite literally just Chain Lightning and Earthquake. So this won't take near as long, but let's take a look at some AoE stuff. This is a pull with Echoes. I'm going to go over the 2 primary Mythic Plus builds, and then talk about some of the quirks of Storm Elemental afterwards. So this is the big pull with Echoes of the Great Sundering on, and the Storm Elemental build. It's all pretty simple. You simply do Chain Lightning Earthquake, Stormkeeper on cooldown, or Chain Lightning Earth Shock, alternating with Earthquake rather. Wait until Call Lightning comes up on the Storm Elemental before using Eye of the Storm. Very important part of AoE that increases the damage of Storm Elemental by 200 or 300%. I forgot the exact number, but it is very relevant, so make sure that cast goes off first. Otherwise, it is quite simple. Earth Shock, Earthquake, generate Maelstrom again. Earth Shock, Earthquake, generate Maelstrom. Quite literally that is it. And as the target counts gets lower, I might switch things up a little bit and change the rotation in order to reflect that. Everything kind of died at the same time, so I didn't. Now let's take a look at the Seeds build, which is in some ways simpler and in some ways less simple. So if you don't know this about the Seeds Legendary, the Night Fae Legendary, it does give you crit after channeling your Night Fae ability, as well as reduce the cooldown of your Storm or Fire Elemental. With this Legendary, I would always play Storm Elemental, never Fire Elemental. But let's see the sequence of events here. So I actually did this a little bit wrong. Ideally, I would have been casting Stormkeeper right now to get it up before starting the sequence. But ignoring that, everything else is correct. Storm Ellie first global into combat into a Fey Transfusion right away. I'm casting the Fey Transfusion while my Storm Elemental is getting Call Lightning up. Ideally, I would have had Stormkeeper up here as well. As soon as Fey Transfusion and Call Lightning are both finished with their cast, you hit Eye of the Storm and begin Chain Lightning Earthquake spam. And that is basically it. That is Ele Shaman AoE in a nutshell. So now let's talk about those quirks I mentioned earlier. We're heading over to Discord for this one. We have been switching up our location quite a bit here, but Yokaira was kind enough to write these up for us. But Stormily does change their rotation quite a bit sometimes. For example, on single target, which will happen a lot, you'll be using Stormily in dungeons a lot, and that does have single target. With Bloodlust up, you will ideally Flame Shock before you Stormily, for one thing, and then only refresh it after that if you're moving. Same thing with Lava Burst. You do not use Lava Burst at all unless you get a proc and you have to move. It allows you to use something while you're moving. And otherwise, it is quite literally just Lightning Bolt and Earth Shock. Without Bloodlust, it is the same, except you want to keep Flame Shock up. Instead of only while moving, you will use it regardless if it's going to fall off. And you will use Lava Surge procs whether you're moving it out as well. Do not hard cast Lava Burst though. And with 2 targets, you forego Flame Shock and Lava Burst unless you are moving again, but you'll just use Chain Lightning and Earthquake, or Earth Shock if you're alternating with Echoes. That is without Bloodlust as well. That's 2 or more target. So one last bit of information for you is regarding the current Mythic Plus Season 2 seasonal affix. Maybe wondering what buffs Ele Shaman should be taking. And personally, I just always take Champion's Brand as far as DPS powers go. The other ones are more personal. What you want, they don't really matter that much. This one of the powers for Cold Heart, the only one that gives you actual damage increases is this one, but I find myself taking Regenerative Fungus a bit as well, especially on things like Grievous. Because staying at a higher health actually helps you quite a bit. You have things like Champion's Brand. Executioner Vareth has good options on all three, so if you really want, like, Volcanic Plumage is very good for crowd controlling mobs, so if you're finding yourself in a group with a lot of Shadow Priests or something, and you think that having more interrupts on trash mobs would help, then this is actually not a bad damage power, especially on Fortified. It actually keeps up pretty well. And Necrotic Wounding can do quite a bit of damage on bosses, so on Tyrannical, it can be a very good option. But personally, I just pretty much always go with Champion's Brand on both the DPS ones. This one's totally personal preference, and then this one, technically Handbook is the best, but I often take Regenerative Fungus anyway. They're kind of the rundown on that. Hopefully this was helpful and you guys learned something from it. If you did, please consider leaving a like on the video, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, thank you for watching. Hopefully I will see you in the future. Peace.